Machiavelli once wrote that men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see and few can understand what you feel. I learned this lesson the hard way during my second year at a consulting firm in Chicago. There was this executive, Patricia, who could walk into any room and instantly command attention without saying a single word. I spent months trying to figure out her secret. It started when our company moved to a new office downtown in late 2019. Patricia had specifically requested the corner office, not because it was bigger, but because it forced everyone to pass by her glass wall to reach the elevator. I watched people unconsciously straighten their posture, adjust their clothes, even practice their facial expressions before walking past her office. She never looked up from her computer, but somehow everyone felt watched. During my first presentation to her team, I made a classic rookie mistake. I sat down immediately when I entered the conference room, putting myself at the same eye level as everyone else. Patricia remained standing by the windows, reviewing documents. For the entire 20-minute presentation, she stayed standing while we all sat there looking up at her. I felt like a child reporting to the principal, even though I was 29 years old and had an MBA. The psychological effect was devastating. Every time I tried to make a point, I found myself speaking faster, rushing through slides, desperately seeking her approval. She would nod occasionally or jot down notes, but her elevated position made every gesture feel like judgment from above. My colleagues later told me they could see my confidence shrinking in real time. The presentation that should have launched my career instead became a masterclass in how physical positioning creates instant hierarchy. 3 months later, I got my chance for revenge, though I didn't realize it at the time. Patricia invited me to present the quarterly analysis to senior partners. This time I arrived early and positioned myself near the whiteboard, naturally forcing everyone, including Patricia, to look up at me. I controlled the lighting, dimming the overhead so my presentation screen became the room's focal point. When Patricia tried to interrupt with questions, I calmly gestured for her to wait while I finished my point. See, transformation was immediate. Partners who had barely acknowledged me before were leaning forward, taking notes, asking follow-up questions. Patricia, suddenly looking up from a seated position, seemed smaller somehow. Her usual commanding presence evaporated when she lost the high ground. After the meeting, 2 partners approached me about leading a new client project. The exact same content, the exact same data, but delivered from a position of visual authority. That night, I realized Patricia hadn't been consciously manipulating anyone. She had internalized something much deeper about human psychology. We are programmed to respond to spatial relationships before we even process words. Height, positioning, movement patterns. These create immediate impressions that our conscious minds rarely question. Every detail of our environment either reinforces or undermines our authority, and most people never even notice the game being played. I started paying attention to how other, successful people controlled their physical environment. My colleague Marcus always stood during phone calls, even when alone in his office, because it affected his tone of voice. The CEO would arrive at meetings exactly 2 minutes late, ensuring everyone was already seated when she made her entrance. These weren't accidents or personality quirks. They were deliberate strategies based on understanding how perception shapes reality. The most unsettling discovery came when I tested these principles in my personal life. During family dinners, I started sitting at the head of the table instead of my usual spot along the side. My younger brother, who normally dominated conversations, became noticeably quieter. My parents unconsciously began directing questions to me first. The family dynamics shifted without anyone understanding why, simply because I had changed my position in the room. Within 6 months, I had been promoted to senior consultant. Patricia, ironically, became one. of my strongest advocates. She later confessed that she respected people who understood the game, even if they had learned to play it against her. What she didn't know was that I had learned everything by watching her lose control of a room for the first time. Power, I realized, isn't about being the smartest person present. It's about controlling how people feel in your presence. The scariest part? Once you start seeing these invisible power dynamics, you can't unsee them. Every meeting, every conversation, every social interaction reveals itself as a carefully choreographed dance, where most people don't even know they're dancing. But recognizing the dance is only the beginning. Understanding how to lead it, that's where things get really interesting. But there was something even more disturbing I discovered about human nature that makes these positioning tricks seem almost innocent by comparison. Machiavelli understood that a prince must learn to be both a fox and a lion. Cunning when force won't work, forceful when cunning isn't enough. But he never could have imagined how modern leaders would perfect the art of making people beg to be dominated. I witnessed this firsthand when I worked briefly for a startup CEO named David Chen, a man who built an empire on voluntary slavery disguised as opportunity. David's company, a fintech startup in Austin, had this culture where nobody ever left before 9 p.m. Not because there was a policy against it, but because David had created an environment where leaving early felt like betrayal. He'd installed this open office concept where his desk sat right in the center, giving him a clear view of everyone. Around 7 p.m., he'd start his evening rounds, casually walking by people's desks, asking about their progress, mentioning how committed the team was. The genius was in how he framed overwork as privilege. During my first week, he pulled me aside and said, "Look around. Every person here could be making twice as much at Google or Facebook. They're here because they believe in something bigger." He was right about the salaries. We were all underpaid by at least 30%. But somehow that became proof of our moral superiority. We weren't mercenaries, we were missionaries. I watched brilliant engineers work 80-hour weeks while David took long lunches with investors. When people burned out and quit, he'd announce their departure as pursuing other opportunities, with this tone that implied they just weren't cut out for greatness. The remaining team would work even harder, terrified of being labeled as quitters. He never threatened anyone's job directly. He didn't need to. He'd created a system where people threatened themselves. The breaking point came during a product launch crisis. Our lead developer, Maria, had been working 3 straight weeks without a real day off. She collapsed at her desk from exhaustion and had to be taken to the hospital. David's response: he sent the entire team an email about how Maria's dedication inspired us all and how we needed to honor her sacrifice by delivering the launch on time. Not once did he acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, working someone into the hospital wasn't inspirational. It was criminal. That's when I understood the difference between Caesar Augustus and Napoleon III. Augustus convinced Rome he was preserving the Republic while slowly concentrating all power in his hands. People felt free while becoming completely subject to his will. Napoleon III, on the other hand, tried to rule through spectacle and propaganda without building genuine loyalty. David was pure Augustus. He made exploitation feel like empowerment until the illusion cracked. I started documenting the psychological techniques David used, the casual mentions of competitors who were less committed, the way he'd praise people publicly for sacrifices that should have been red flags, the strategic vulnerability he'd show, admitting his own fears about the company's future, making everyone feel responsible for saving his dream. Every manipulation felt like care, every demand felt like opportunity. The scary part was how well it worked on me initially. For my first 3 months, I genuinely believed I was part of something special. I worked weekends voluntarily, skipped family, dinners for urgent projects, that turned out to be routine tasks and felt proud when David complimented my commitment. I was performing my own exploitation while thanking him for the privilege. Everything changed when I met Rebecca, a former employee at a coffee shop near the office. She'd worked for David 2 years earlier and burned out after 18 months. "He's got this gift," she said, stirring sugar into her latte. "He makes you feel chosen, like you're part of his inner circle, until you realize the inner circle is just whoever's willing to bleed the most for his bank account." I quit 2 weeks later, but not before learning something crucial about modern power. The most dangerous leaders aren't the ones who demand obedience. They're the ones who make you compete to give it to them. David never ordered anyone to work late. He just created conditions where not working late felt like personal failure. The chains were invisible, but they were stronger than any slave owner's whip. Looking back, I realized David's company was just a laboratory for something much larger. Every day, millions of people wake up and voluntarily submit to systems designed to extract their time, energy, and dreams while making them grateful for the opportunity. Understanding how this works is the first step toward freedom. But recognizing these modern manipulation tactics is useless if you don't understand the deeper psychological programming that makes them possible in the first place. Machiavelli warned that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. What he couldn't foresee was how modern life would turn decision fatigue into the ultimate weapon of control. I discovered this during what I now call my retail therapy nightmare at a car dealership in Phoenix back in 2021. I walked into Henderson Toyota on a Saturday morning, planning to buy a reliable used Camry and drive out within 2 hours. 4.5 hours later, I stumbled out having signed papers for a brand new Prius with extended warranty, gap insurance, paint protection, and financing terms I barely understood. The salesman, Kevin, had turned my brain into mush without me even realizing it was happening. Kevin's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. He started by showing me 12 different cars over 2 hours, each with minor flaws he'd point out. "This one's great, but the interior's a bit worn. Love this model, but it's got higher mileage than I'd recommend." By the time he showed me the new Prius, my mental energy was completely depleted. When he said, "This one's perfect for you," I felt grateful rather than suspicious. The paperwork phase was where Kevin truly shined. He'd present me with decision after decision. Do you want the midnight black or the pearl white? Standard mats or all weather? 5-year warranty or 7-year? Each choice felt small and manageable, but there were 37 separate decisions in total. I started saying yes to things just to make the process end. My willpower had been systematically drained through what psychologists call cognitive overload. The genius wasn't in the individual manipulations, it was in the sequence. Kevin had studied human psychology well enough to know that decision-making depletes glucose in the brain. By lunchtime, I was literally too mentally exhausted to think clearly. When he suggested financing instead of paying cash to build credit, I agreed even though I had enough savings to buy the car outright. I just wanted to stop making decisions. 3 days later, reviewing the contracts with my accountant, I realized I'd been completely played. The monthly payments over 7 years would cost me $18,000 more than the car's actual value. The extended warranty duplicated coverage I already had through my insurance. The paint protection was a $100 service I'd paid $800 for. Kevin had turned my exhaustion into his commission. This experience opened my eyes to how decision fatigue is weaponized everywhere in modern life. Grocery stores place expensive items at eye level after you've been making choices. For 30 minutes, software companies bury privacy settings behind dozens of preference screens. Even dating apps overwhelm you with profiles until you start swiping right automatically just to reduce the cognitive load. At my corporate job, I started noticing how my boss, Jennifer, would schedule complex discussions right after long planning meetings. She'd wait until we were all mentally drained, then present her preferred solutions as the obvious choice. Projects that should have sparked debate would get approved without discussion because everyone was too cognitively exhausted to fight. She wasn't being malicious, she was being strategic. The most disturbing realization came when I applied this to my relationship patterns. I'd always wondered why I made terrible romantic decisions after stressful work days. The answer was simple. My decision-making capacity was already depleted by the time I got home. I'd agree to plans I didn't want, tolerate behavior I normally wouldn't, and make commitments I'd regret the next morning. Learning to recognize cognitive overload changed everything. I started scheduling important decisions for mornings when my mental energy was fresh. During negotiations, I'd take breaks to let my brain recover. When salespeople started the small decisions that add up routine, I'd politely end the interaction and return another day. My wallet and my life improved dramatically. The scariest part is how few people understand this vulnerability. We're surrounded by systems designed to exhaust our mental resources before presenting us with choices that benefit others more than ourselves. Every subscription service, every political campaign, every marketing strategy now includes decision fatigue as a core component. But understanding how our minds get hijacked by choice overload is just the beginning. What's even more frightening is how our brains respond to authority figures when we're in this weakened state. Machiavelli observed that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. He understood that perception shapes reality, but he never could have imagined how modern neuroscience would prove just how automatic our submission to authority really is. I learned this lesson during a medical emergency that almost cost me my life because I trusted a white coat over my own instincts. It was February 2020, right before everything shut down, and I'd been having severe chest pains for 3 days. At the emergency room in Denver, a young guy in scrubs, who looked barely old enough to drive, took one look at me and declared it was just anxiety. He had the confident tone, the medical terminology, the official clipboard, every visual cue my brain associated with medical authority. Despite feeling like an elephant was sitting on my chest, I believed him. Dr. Mitchell, if that was even his real name, spent maybe 4 minutes with me total. No EKG, no blood work, just a quick listen with his stethoscope and a prescription for Xanax. "You're 28 and healthy," he said dismissively. "Heart attacks don't happen to people like you." The white coat, the hospital setting, the authoritative delivery, my brain shut down its critical thinking and accepted his diagnosis completely. I went home and suffered for 2 more days before my girlfriend Sarah practically dragged me to a different hospital. This time, the attending physician immediately ordered comprehensive tests. Turns out I was having a rare but serious reaction to a supplement I'd been taking. My potassium levels were dangerously low, causing cardiac arrhythmia that could have killed me. The real doctor was appalled when I told him about my first visit. That experience made me obsess over authority psychology. I started reading about Stanley Milgram's experiments from the 1960s, where ordinary people administered what they believed were lethal electric shocks, just because a man in a lab coat told them to. What blew my mind wasn't that 65% of people followed orders. It was how dramatically obedience dropped when you changed tiny details about the authority figure. When the scientist gave orders by phone instead of in person, compliance dropped to 21%. When he wore street clothes instead of a lab coat, it fell to 20%. When the victim was in the same room as the participant, obedience plummeted to 40%. Our brains have these hardwired shortcuts for recognizing authority, And those shortcuts can be hacked with costume changes and environmental staging. I started seeing these authority triggers everywhere. My financial advisor, Marcus, always met clients in his corner office filled with diplomas, awards, and photos of him shaking hands with politicians. He'd wear expensive suits and speak in calm, measured tones about portfolio optimization strategies. Most clients, including me initially, never questioned his recommendations because the environmental cues screamed, "Trustworthy expert." The wake-up call came when I discovered Marcus had been churning accounts to generate commissions, buying and selling stocks unnecessarily to rack up fees. His actual performance was mediocre at best, but his office theater was Academy Award worthy. When I confronted him, he seemed genuinely surprised that I'd done my own research. "Most people just want to feel confident about their investments," he admitted. He wasn't wrong. Social media took authority manipulation to terrifying new levels. I watched my cousin Jake get sucked into following this fitness influencer who called himself Dr. Muscle, despite having no medical degree. The guy posted workout videos from what looked like a professional gym, wore scrubs in some videos, and spoke with the same confident authority as a real physician. Jake spent $800 on his supplement program before discovering the doctor was actually a community college dropout. The most disturbing realization was how easily I could weaponize these same triggers. When I started freelance consulting, I bought expensive business cards, rented conference rooms in upscale hotels for client meetings, and crafted an email signature full of impressive-sounding credentials. My rates doubled overnight, not because my work improved, but because I'd learned to package authority more convincingly. At networking events, I started paying attention to who people gravitated toward. It was never the most knowledgeable person in the room. It was whoever best performed the visual and verbal cues of expertise. The right handshake, the appropriate pauses before speaking, the strategic name-dropping. Authority was less about competence and more about convincing performance. The scariest part is how this knowledge changed my perception of everything. Every expert on TV, every professional I hired, every leader I followed, I couldn't help but analyze which authority triggers they were using and whether their actual expertise matched their presentation. Most of the time, it didn't. But recognizing these neurological authority hacks is only half the battle. What's even more insidious is how skilled manipulators use our rebellion against authority to control us in ways we never see coming. Machiavelli wrote that, since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. But the master manipulators I've encountered understood something even more sophisticated: how to make rebellion feel like freedom while keeping you exactly where they want you. I learned this the hard way during my 2 years at a progressive marketing agency that turned employee dissent into a profit center. The company was called Rebel Creative, and everything about it screamed anti-establishment. Exposed brick walls, beanbag chairs, a beer tap in the break room, and a CEO named Brandon, who insisted everyone call him by his first name. During my interview, he spent 20 minutes ranting about how traditional agencies were soul-crushing corporate machines and how Rebel Creative was different. "We were revolutionaries," he said. "We were changing the industry. Brandon encouraged us to challenge everything. Got a problem with a client strategy? Speak up in the all-hands meeting. Think a deadline is unrealistic? Push back publicly. Hate the office layout? Organize a committee to redesign it." For my first 6 months, I felt like I was working at the most democratic company in America. I was constantly voicing opinions, suggesting changes, feeling heard and valued. The genius of Brandon's system revealed itself slowly. Yes, we could complain about anything, except the things that actually mattered. We could redesign the office layout, but never question why we worked 60-hour weeks. We could criticize client strategies, but never examine why our health insurance was terrible. We could challenge deadlines, but never discuss why our salaries were 20% below industry standard. I started documenting what topics generated pushback versus what got encouraged. Complaints about workload, dismissed as not being solution-oriented. Questions about equity or profit sharing, redirected to culture committee discussions that never led anywhere. But suggest a new coffee machine or criticize a client's brand colors, Brandon would practically throw a parade in your honor. The breakthrough came during a heated team meeting about a campaign for a pharmaceutical client. Our art director, Jessica, had serious ethical concerns about promoting a drug with dangerous side effects. She presented research, cited studies, made a compelling case. Brandon listened thoughtfully, praised her critical thinking, then assigned the project to someone else, while keeping Jessica on smaller, safer accounts. I realized we weren't rebels, we were safety valves. Brandon had created a system where dissent was not only allowed but celebrated, as long as it stayed within carefully defined boundaries. We felt revolutionary while being completely controlled. Our rebellion was choreographed, our resistance was managed, our freedom was an illusion that made us more compliant than traditional employees. This pattern extended far beyond our office walls. I started noticing how social media platforms encourage users to speak truth to power about celebrities, politicians, and cultural issues, while making it nearly impossible to organize meaningful challenges to the platforms themselves. You can tweet criticism of billionaires all day, but try to coordinate a real boycott of their companies and watch your reach mysteriously diminish. Political systems work the same way. Americans can protest, march, and rage against individual politicians while the fundamental structures that created those politicians remain untouched. The system doesn't fear your anger about the latest scandal. It feeds on that anger, channels it into harmless outlets, and uses your passion to fuel the next election cycle. Even in my personal relationships, I discovered this dynamic. My ex-girlfriend Rachel would encourage me to voice complaints about little things, how I loaded the dishwasher, which movies we watched, where we went for dinner. But when I tried to discuss bigger issues like our future plans or financial compatibility, suddenly I was being too serious or creating unnecessary drama. The most disturbing realization was how well this controlled rebellion worked on me. I felt heard, valued, and free because I could complain loudly about surface-level issues. That feeling of pseudo-rebellion satisfied my need for autonomy while keeping me locked in systems that benefited others more than myself. I was a happy slave who thought he was fighting the machine. Breaking free required recognizing the difference between performative rebellion and actual resistance. Real threats to power don't get encouraged. They get ignored, redirected, or quietly eliminated. If your rebellion makes your boss smile, you're not rebelling at all. But understanding controlled rebellion is just the beginning. The really sophisticated manipulators don't just manage your resistance. They make you complicit in designing your own prison. Machiavelli observed that men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. What he understood intuitively, modern psychology has proven scientifically, we don't submit to power because it makes logical sense. We submit because it fills emotional voids we're too ashamed to admit we have. I learned this during my most embarrassing professional relationship with a mentor who exploited my daddy issues for his own gain. His name was Richard Blackstone, and he ran a real estate investment firm in Miami, where I worked as an analyst, fresh out of college in 2018. Richard was everything my absent father wasn't. Successful, confident, present and seemingly interested in my development. During my first week, he invited me to lunch at an expensive steakhouse and spent 2 hours asking about my background, my goals, my fears. I felt chosen, special, like someone finally saw my potential. Richard had this way of making criticism feel like love. When I'd mess up a financial model, he'd pull me aside and say things like, "You're too smart to make mistakes like this. I see greatness in you, but you've got to want it more than I want it for you." Instead of feeling attacked, I felt grateful that someone cared enough to push me. My need for paternal approval, which I'd been carrying around for 23 years, finally had somewhere to go. The manipulation escalated gradually. Richard started inviting me to work weekends, saying it was special training that he only offered to his most promising analysts. I'd spend Saturdays doing research that benefited his personal investments while he played golf, but he framed it as mentorship. "You're learning from deals worth millions," he'd say. "Harvard MBAs would kill for this access." I worked for free because it felt like privilege. Within 6 months, I was completely psychologically dependent on Richard's approval. I'd check my phone obsessively for his texts, work late, hoping he'd notice my dedication, and feel genuinely depressed when he was traveling for business. My girlfriend Emma pointed out that I talked about Richard more than anyone else in my life, including her. When she suggested maybe the relationship was unhealthy, I defended him like she'd insulted my actual father. The spell broke during a company holiday party when I overheard Richard talking to another partner about his analyst rotation system. He'd cycle through young, ambitious kids from broken homes, give them intensive attention for 6 to 12 months until they burned out, then replace them with fresh recruits. "The hungrier they are for approval, the harder they work," he said, laughing. "Daddy issues are my secret weapon." I realized Richard hadn't seen potential in me. He'd seen vulnerability. My desperate need for male validation, stemming from my father's abandonment when I was 8, had made me the perfect mark. Richard was a psychological vampire who fed on emotional neediness and converted it into free labor. Every mentorship session had been a transaction where I paid with my dignity and he collected profit. This experience made me hypersensitive to emotional manipulation in other contexts. I started noticing how my college roommate Jake got sucked into a multi-level marketing scheme by a mentor who promised to help him unlock his entrepreneurial potential. The recruiter had identified Jake's insecurity about his middle-class background and exploited it masterfully, making expensive starter packages feel like investments in his self-worth. Even my dating life became clearer through this lens. I'd been attracted to women who made me work for their attention because it recreated the familiar dynamic of seeking approval from someone emotionally unavailable. My neediness wasn't romantic. It was compulsive, and it made me easy to manipulate by anyone who understood how to withhold and dispense validation strategically. The most disturbing realization was how prevalent this dynamic is in modern life. Social media platforms are literally designed to exploit our need for validation, turning likes and comments into addictive reward systems. Political movements recruit followers by identifying their emotional wounds and promising healing. Through ideology, even fitness influencers and life coaches build businesses around making people feel broken, then selling them the cure. Understanding my own emotional vulnerabilities didn't make them disappear, but it did make them visible. I started asking myself what emotional needs someone was promising to fill before I trusted their advice or accepted their authority. Most of the time, anyone offering to meet deep psychological needs in exchange for money, time, or obedience was running a con, even if they believed their own pitch. The hardest lesson was learning to meet my own emotional needs instead of outsourcing them to charismatic strangers. Approval seeking had made me vulnerable to every manipulator who understood basic psychology. Only by filling my own emotional tanks could I engage with powerful people from a position of strength rather than neediness. But emotional manipulation is just one layer of modern control. The really sophisticated operators don't just exploit your feelings, they turn your daily routines into unconscious rituals of submission. Machiavelli knew that everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are. But he lived in an age when power rituals were obvious. Crowns, thrones, public executions. Modern domination hides behind the illusion of efficiency and collaboration. I discovered this during my 3 years at a Fortune 500 consulting firm, where every meeting was actually a ceremony designed to reinforce who belonged where in the hierarchy. The company was McKinsey & Associates, and they had perfected the art of making submission feel like professional development. Every Monday morning, we'd gather for something called knowledge-sharing sessions, where junior consultants would present findings to senior partners. Sounds educational, right? It was actually a weekly ritual of public humiliation disguised as learning. The setup was choreographed like a courtroom. Junior consultants stood at the front, presenting to senior partners who remained seated at a horseshoe-shaped table. We weren't allowed to use chairs. "It keeps you sharp and focused," they said. The partners would interrupt with questions designed to expose gaps in our knowledge, often about information we couldn't possibly have accessed. "Have you considered the implications for the Southeast Asian market?" They'd ask about a project focused entirely on domestic retail. I watched brilliant analysts stumble through these sessions week after week, not because they were incompetent, but because the ritual wasn't designed for success, it was designed for submission. The partners already knew the answers to their questions. They weren't testing our knowledge, they were demonstrating their authority. Every and "I'm not sure" reinforced the hierarchy more effectively than any org chart ever could. The genius was in making us grateful for the abuse. After particularly brutal sessions, partners would approach us privately with feedback and mentorship opportunities. "I know today was tough," Senior Partner Williams once told me, "but that's how we separate the wheat from the chaff. You've got potential. Don't let setbacks discourage you." I actually thanked him for the psychological beating and promised to do better next week. These weren't isolated incidents, they were systematic programming. The firm had dozens of similar rituals that served no practical purpose beyond establishing dominance. Elevator pitches, where junior staff had exactly 30 seconds to summarize complex projects while partners timed them. Devil's advocate sessions, where senior consultants would attack our recommendations regardless of quality. Stretch assignments that were guaranteed to overwhelm us, then used as evidence that we needed more development. The most insidious ritual was something called 360-degree feedback, where everyone rated everyone else's performance. Sounds democratic, but the scoring system was rigged. Partners' opinions carried exponentially more weight than junior staff, and anyone who consistently rated poorly would find themselves mysteriously excluded from high-profile projects. We learned to praise upward and criticize downward, reinforcing the hierarchy while pretending to participate in honest evaluation. I started recognizing these domination rituals everywhere once I knew what to look for. Tech companies with their stand-up meetings where everyone reports their daily activities to a scrum master. Law firms with moot court sessions where junior associates defend cases they know nothing about. Even restaurants where servers have to recite daily specials from memory while managers watch for mistakes. The breaking point came when I realized I was perpetuating the same rituals in my personal life. During family dinners, I'd unconsciously adopted the McKinsey interrogation style, asking my younger brother rapid-fire questions about his college plans and job search. I was treating him like a junior consultant who needed to prove his worth to earn my approval. My girlfriend Sarah called me out during one particularly obnoxious performance. "You're not his boss," she said. "Why are you making him defend his life choices like he's presenting to a board of directors?" She was right. I'd internalized the ritual so completely that I was reproducing it in relationships where it made no sense. The most disturbing realization was how these rituals replaced genuine competence evaluation with theater. At McKinsey, your ability to survive Monday morning humiliation sessions mattered more than your analytical skills or client results. The ritual had become the reality, and everyone pretended this was normal professional development. Breaking free required conscious resistance to participating in meaningless power ceremonies. When new firms tried to put me through similar rituals during interviews, I'd politely decline or reframe the interaction. I'd be happy to discuss my approach to that challenge in a collaborative conversation rather than a formal presentation, became my standard response. But recognizing these obvious domination rituals was just the beginning. The really dangerous manipulation happens when authority figures convince you to participate in building your own psychological prison. Machiavelli understood that it is not titles that honor men, but men that honor titles. Yet in our modern world, we've created systems where borrowed credibility can be more powerful than actual competence. I learned this the hard way when I almost lost my life savings to a financial advisor whose only real qualification was knowing how to rent legitimacy from more successful people. The man's name was Trevor Hamilton, and he reached out to me through LinkedIn in early 2022 after I'd posted about a successful real estate investment. His profile was impressive: Harvard Business School education, former Goldman Sachs analyst, founder of Hamilton Wealth Management. His office in downtown Seattle was filled with awards, diplomas, and photos of him shaking hands with Warren Buffett, Jamie Dimon, and other financial titans. During our first meeting, Trevor casually mentioned his mentorship under legendary investor Carl Icahn and showed me a framed photo of them at some conference. He spoke fluent Wall Street jargon, quoted market statistics effortlessly, and presented a portfolio strategy that seemed sophisticated beyond my understanding. When he offered to manage my retirement savings for just a modest 2% annual fee, I felt lucky to have access to such elite expertise. The red flags were there, but I ignored them because of the borrowed authority surrounding Trevor. His Harvard MBA was real, but from their weekend executive program, not the full-time degree program he implied. His Goldman Sachs experience lasted exactly 6 months before he was let go for performance issues. The photos with financial celebrities were from public conference meet and greets that anyone could purchase access to for a few $100s. 6 months into our relationship, I discovered Trevor's actual track record. His fund had underperformed the S&P 500 for 3 consecutive years. His sophisticated strategies were basic index fund allocations he could have gotten from any robo-advisor for 1/10 the cost. The client testimonials on his website were either fabricated or from friends who'd never actually invested with him. The most shocking revelation came when I hired a private investigator to verify Trevor's credentials. His Harvard Business School education was a 2-week executive seminar. His former Goldman Sachs experience was an unpaid internship that ended badly. The awards in his office were purchased from diploma mills or given to anyone who attended certain industry conferences. He'd constructed an entire professional identity from borrowed fragments of other people's legitimacy. This experience made me obsess over how authority transfer works in our society. I started paying attention to how people like Dr. Oz leveraged legitimate medical credentials to sell questionable supplements. or how former politicians use their government experience to endorse products completely unrelated to their expertise. The pattern was always the same. Take real authority on domain and apply it to areas where you have no special knowledge. Social media amplified this phenomenon exponentially. I watched fitness influencers with zero medical training give health advice because they had impressive physiques. Business coaches with failed startups sold success strategies to aspiring entrepreneurs. Life coaches who'd never built anything meaningful charged premium rates for wisdom they'd borrowed from books and TED Talks. The most disturbing case was my cousin Mark, who got caught up with a cryptocurrency guru named Bitcoin Ben. Ben had been featured in some legitimate financial publications early in his career, but he leveraged those appearances into authority over everything from investing to life philosophy. Mark invested $30,000 in Ben's crypto course and trading program, losing most of it when Ben's predictions proved worthless. I realized our brains are hardwired to make these authority transfers as cognitive shortcuts. If someone seems credible in one area, we assume competence across related domains to save mental energy. This evolutionary adaptation made sense when communities were small and expertise was general, but it's become a massive vulnerability in our complex, specialized world. The breakthrough came when I started applying what I called the domain test to everyone who claimed expertise. I'd ask specific questions about their direct experience in the exact area they were advising me about. Real experts could provide detailed answers about challenges they'd personally overcome. Fake experts would deflect with generalities or retreat to their borrowed credentials. Building my own legitimate authority required the opposite approach, going deep in specific areas rather than broad across many. Instead of claiming expertise in wealth management, I developed genuine knowledge about rental property investing in Pacific Northwest markets. Instead of generic business strategy, I specialized in helping tech startups navigate acquisition processes. The irony is that once I stopped chasing borrowed authority and built real competence, people started seeking my advice voluntarily. Genuine expertise attracts followers naturally, while borrowed authority requires constant performance to maintain the illusion. But understanding authority manipulation is only valuable if you can recognize when you're being made complicit in more sophisticated psychological games. Machiavelli wrote that men are more ready to repay an injury than a benefit, because gratitude is a burden and revenge a pleasure. What he couldn't foresee was how understanding the psychology of resistance would become the ultimate tool for controlling it. I discovered this during the most toxic relationship of my life, where my ex-girlfriend Sarah used my own rebellion against me like a master chess player. The pattern started innocently enough when we began dating in Portland back in 2019. Sarah had this way of making small requests that felt slightly unreasonable, asking me to cancel plans with friends for last-minute dates, suggesting I spend weekends at her place instead of mine, hinting that my apartment was too masculine and needed her feminine touch. When I'd resist these suggestions, she wouldn't argue. She'd just get quietly disappointed and withdraw emotionally. At first, I thought I was standing my ground successfully. I'd refuse her requests and feel proud of maintaining my independence. But I started noticing a predictable cycle in my resistance. Stage 1 was immediate discomfort when she'd make unreasonable demands. Stage 2 was private complaining to my roommate Jake about her controlling behavior. Stage 3 was passive resistance. I'd technically comply, but with obvious reluctance. By stage 4, I'd moved to direct confrontation, telling Sarah I felt manipulated and needed more space. That's when she'd deploy her secret weapon. She'd become vulnerable and apologetic, admitting she was just scared of losing me and promising to respect my boundaries. I'd feel like the bad guy for being harsh with someone who was just insecure. Stage 5 was always the same, complete surrender disguised as compromise. The genius of Sarah's system was that she let me experience all 5 stages of resistance before getting what she wanted. My brain interpreted going through the full resistance cycle as evidence that I'd maintained my autonomy, even though the final outcome was always her preference. She never forced me to do anything. She just created conditions where not doing what she wanted felt cruel and unreasonable. 6 months into the relationship, I realized I was living almost entirely according to Sarah's preferences, while believing I'd chosen everything freely. We hung out with her friends exclusively because mine were immature. We spent money on her priorities because my interests were wasteful. We made major decisions based on her timeline because my approach was indecisive. I'd resisted each change individually, but lost the war completely. The breakthrough came when my brother visited from Chicago and pointed out how different I'd become. "You used to have opinions about everything," he said over coffee. "Now you check your phone before deciding what to eat for breakfast." He was right. My resistance had become so predictable that Sarah could orchestrate it like conducting a symphony. I started documenting this resistance pattern in other areas of my life. At work, my boss Jennifer would make unreasonable requests. I'd go through the same 5 stages and end up working weekends while feeling like I'd negotiated successfully. With my landlord, credit card companies, even subscription services, everyone seemed to understand my resistance psychology better than I did. The most disturbing realization was how political and marketing systems exploit these same resistance stages. Politicians introduce extreme policies knowing you'll resist, then offer compromises that were their actual goals all along. Companies launch products at artificially high prices, wait for consumer backlash, then offer discounts to the price they always intended to charge. Breaking free required understanding that predictable resistance is just another form of control. Real autonomy doesn't come from going through resistance motions. It comes from making conscious choices based on your actual values rather than emotional reactions to manipulation. I had to learn the difference between strategic resistance and automatic rebellion. The hardest lesson was recognizing when my resistance was being used against me. If someone seemed to expect and accommodate my pushback, I was probably being played. Real threats to someone's agenda don't get gentle management. They get eliminated quickly and decisively. After Sarah and I broke up, I started relationships differently. Instead of automatically resisting unreasonable requests, I'd evaluate whether the request aligned with my actual goals and values. Sometimes the answer was yes, sometimes no. But the decision came from conscious choice rather than predictable emotional cycles. My dating life improved dramatically when I stopped performing resistance and started practicing genuine selectivity. Women who were used to managing resistance through the 5-stage cycle found me unpredictable and either adapted to honest communication or moved on to easier targets. But understanding resistance patterns was just preparation for the really sophisticated manipulation techniques. The masters don't fight your resistance. They make you complicit in designing your own psychological prison. Machiavelli observed that he who builds on the people builds on mud. But even he couldn't have imagined how modern technology would turn that mud into quicksand. The most insidious control systems don't imprison you. They convince you to build your own cage while thanking them for the materials. I learned this during my 3-year addiction to social media that nearly destroyed my career, relationships, and mental health. It started innocently in 2020 when I joined Instagram to promote my freelance consulting business. The platform seemed like a gift. Free marketing, unlimited reach, direct access to potential clients. I'd post content, about business strategy, engage with other consultants, and slowly build my professional brand. Within 6 months, I had 5,000 followers and was landing clients through social media connections. But Instagram's algorithm had been studying me from day one, learning my triggers, mapping my insecurities, identifying my psychological weak points. The platform discovered I was most active between 10 p.m. and midnight when I felt lonely and sought validation. It found that posts about my business struggles got more engagement than success stories. It learned that I'd refresh obsessively after posting, desperate for likes and comments. The addiction escalated when Instagram started showing me exactly what I needed to stay hooked. Inspiring business quotes when I felt discouraged, success stories from other entrepreneurs when I doubted myself, notifications about comments precisely when my attention was drifting to other activities. The algorithm wasn't serving me content, it was serving me customized emotional drugs designed to keep me scrolling. Within a year, I was spending 4 to 6 hours daily on social media while telling myself it was business development. I'd wake up and immediately check my phone for overnight engagement. I'd interrupt conversations to photograph content opportunities. I'd feel genuinely anxious when my posts received fewer likes than expected, as if my professional worth was measured in double taps. The breaking point came when I realized Instagram knew me better than I knew myself. The platform could predict my mood based on my scrolling speed, my likelihood to purchase based on my engagement patterns, even my political opinions based on how long I spent viewing certain posts. I wasn't using social media, it was using me as a data source while convincing me I was building my brand. I started documenting how much personal information I'd voluntarily surrendered. My location data revealed where I lived, worked, and socialized. My engagement patterns exposed my insecurities, desires, and vulnerabilities. My contact list gave them access to my entire social network. My search history painted a detailed psychological profile. I'd constructed my own surveillance system while believing I was building a business. The most disturbing realization was how this voluntary data surrender extended beyond social media. My smartphone tracked my physical movements and sold that information to retailers. My credit cards analyzed my spending patterns and shared them with marketing companies. My streaming services monitored my viewing habits and used them to influence my political opinions through content recommendations. Even my smart home devices were building psychological profiles. My Alexa recorded conversations and analyzed my family dynamics. My fitness tracker monitored my sleep patterns and stress levels. My smart thermostat learned my daily routines and sold that information to insurance companies. I'd invited surveillance into my most private spaces while paying for the privilege. The genius of this system was making participation feel essential rather than optional. Opting out of social media meant losing business opportunities. Avoiding smartphone tracking meant being unable to navigate or communicate effectively. Refusing to use streaming services meant social isolation. The architecture of modern life required voluntary surrender of privacy and autonomy. Breaking free required recognizing that convenience always comes with hidden costs. Every app that promised to make life easier was actually making me more dependent on systems designed to extract value from my behavior. I started asking what data I was providing and how it might be used against me before adopting any new technology. The withdrawal process was brutal. Deleting social media apps felt like losing a limb. My phone seemed useless without constant notifications. I experienced genuine depression when I lost the dopamine hits from likes and comments. I'd been chemically addicted to validation from an algorithm designed to exploit my psychological vulnerabilities. Rebuilding my business without social media forced me to develop real relationships instead of performing for an audience. I started attending networking events, making phone calls, having actual conversations with potential clients. My income initially dropped, but the clients I gained through genuine connections were higher quality and more loyal. The most important lesson was understanding that free platforms aren't really free. You pay with your autonomy, attention, and personal data. The cage feels comfortable because it's custom built for your specific psychological needs, but it's still a cage designed to extract value from your captivity. But even understanding technological manipulation isn't enough preparation for the ultimate form of control. When powerful, people make you compete to surrender your freedom. Machiavelli warned that a wise prince must never be idle in times of peace, but industriously lay up stores of which he may make use in times of adversity. The modern princes of industry took this advice and weaponized it into something far more sophisticated. They make you compete to give them your freedom. I witnessed this firsthand when I got recruited by Amazon's corporate headquarters in Seattle, where Jeff Bezos had built the ultimate machine for extracting human potential while making people grateful for the privilege. The recruitment process began in early 2021 when a headhunter contacted me about a senior analyst position at Amazon Web Services. The salary was 40% higher than my current job, plus stock options, plus benefits that seemed almost too good to be true. During the interview process, they made it clear that Amazon wasn't for everyone. They only wanted high performers who could handle their unique culture. What they called culture, I later understood, was systematic psychological manipulation disguised as excellence standards. Amazon had created something called leadership principles that weren't just guidelines. They were a secular religion that employees recited, internalized, and used to justify working themselves into the ground. Principles like customer obsession, ownership, and deliver results sounded inspiring until you realized they were code for sacrifice everything for the company. My manager, a woman named Rebecca Chen, was a master of what I now recognize as consensual exploitation. She never directly ordered anyone to work weekends or stay late. Instead, she'd send emails at 11 p.m. with subject lines like exciting opportunity for someone who wants to stretch themselves. She'd frame 60-hour work weeks as fast-track development and cancelled vacations as stepping up when the team needs you most. The genius was in the selection process. Amazon didn't hire people and then break them. They hired people who were already psychologically primed to break themselves. During interviews, they'd ask questions like, "Tell me about a time you went above and beyond what was required." They weren't evaluating your skills. They were screening for people whose self-worth was tied to over-delivering. Within 3 months, I was working 70-hour weeks while feeling proud of my commitment. I'd skip meals during deep dive sessions, cancel social plans for critical deadlines, and respond to emails at midnight to demonstrate my ownership mentality. The scariest part wasn't that I was being exploited, it was that I felt chosen, special, like I was part of an elite group that ordinary people couldn't handle. The psychological programming went deeper than just work hours. Amazon had created internal systems that made employees compete against each other for resources, recognition, and survival. The annual review process ranked people on curves, meaning someone had to fail for others to succeed. Teams were deliberately under-resourced, forcing employees to fight for basic tools and support. I started noticing how this competitive scarcity extended beyond work. Employees would skip bathroom breaks during long meetings to avoid seeming uncommitted. People would work through illnesses to demonstrate mental toughness. I watched colleagues miss their children's birthdays and anniversaries while telling themselves they were building something important. The breaking point came when my team was assigned an impossible deadline. launch a new product feature in 6 weeks that should have taken 6 months. Instead of pushing back, everyone started working around the clock, fueled by caffeine and the belief that failure would prove we weren't Amazonian enough. 3 people ended up in the hospital with stress-related conditions, and the project launched broken anyway. That's when I realized Bezos had built something more insidious than a sweatshop. He'd created a cult where members voluntarily destroyed their health, relationships, and sanity while competing for the honor of sacrificing more. The company didn't need to force compliance because employees policed themselves and each other, turning peer pressure into a self-sustaining exploitation machine. The most disturbing revelation was how this model had spread throughout Silicon Valley and beyond. Companies like Tesla, where Elon Musk convinced employees they were saving humanity while working them to exhaustion. Netflix, with its keeper test culture that made everyone feel constantly under threat of replacement. Startups everywhere adopted Amazon's playbook of making overwork feel like opportunity. I quit Amazon after 8 months, but the psychological damage lasted much longer. I'd internalized their metrics for measuring human worth, productivity, availability, willingness to sacrifice personal needs for corporate goals. It took years of therapy to unlearn the belief that my value as a person was determined by how much I could endure. The hardest lesson was recognizing how I'd been complicit in my own exploitation. Amazon hadn't tricked me into working there. They'd identified my psychological vulnerabilities and created conditions where exploiting myself felt like personal growth. I'd built my own prison while competing with other inmates for who could make their cell more restrictive. Understanding consensual manipulation changed how I evaluate every opportunity, relationship, and commitment. When someone makes me feel special for accepting difficult conditions, I know I'm being set up. When organizations talk about being different or requiring special people, I hear recruitment pitches for voluntary exploitation systems. But recognizing these manipulation systems is meaningless unless you can develop the psychological immunity to resist them when it matters most. Machiavelli's final wisdom was that the end justifies the means only when you control both the end and the means. After years of being manipulated, exploited, and psychologically controlled by everyone from car salesmen to corporate executives, I finally understood what he meant. True freedom doesn't come from rejecting all authority. It comes from choosing consciously when to submit and when to resist based on your own strategic objectives. The breakthrough happened during my divorce proceedings in late 2022, when I had to choose between my lawyer's advice and my own instincts. My attorney, Patricia Kellerman, wanted me to pursue an aggressive strategy that would maximize my financial settlement, but destroy any possibility of maintaining a civil relationship with my ex-wife. "We can take her for everything," Patricia said, eyes gleaming with the prospect of a lucrative court battle. But I stopped and asked myself the 5 questions that had become my decision-making framework. Who benefits from this approach? What's the real cost to me beyond money? What precedent am I setting for how I handle conflict? Are there alternatives I'm not seeing? Does this move me toward or away from my actual goals? The answers were revealing. Patricia would benefit from months of billable hours. The real cost would be years of acrimony affecting our children. The precedent would establish me as someone who prioritizes winning over long-term relationships. The alternative was collaborative mediation that Patricia had dismissed as leaving money on the table. My actual goal was rebuilding my life peacefully, not maximizing short-term financial gain. I fired Patricia and chose mediation instead. The settlement was smaller, but fair. The process took 3 months instead of 3 years, and my ex-wife and I maintained enough goodwill to co-parent effectively. Most importantly, I'd made a conscious choice about when to follow expert advice and when to trust my own judgment. This framework transformed every area of my life. When my new boss at a consulting firm tried to implement Amazon-style leadership principles, I consciously chose to comply with visible requirements while protecting my boundaries around overtime and weekend work. I performed competence and commitment during business hours, but refused to compete in the voluntary exploitation game. The key was understanding the difference between strategic compliance and unconscious submission. I'd follow dress codes because they cost me nothing and avoided unnecessary conflict. I'd participate in team meetings because collaboration served my professional goals, but I wouldn't sacrifice my health, relationships, or personal values just to signal commitment to someone else's agenda. Dating became much simpler once I applied this strategic consciousness. When women tested my boundaries with unreasonable requests or emotional manipulation, I'd evaluate whether accommodating them served any purpose beyond avoiding short-term conflict. Usually, it didn't. I learned to say no without explaining myself, to end relationships that required me to perform rather than simply be myself. The most powerful application came in my business relationships. Instead of automatically trusting experts based on their credentials, I'd evaluate whether their advice aligned with my actual objectives. When financial advisors pushed expensive products, when consultants recommended complex solutions, when coaches promised transformation through their programs, I'd ask who really benefited from following their guidance. Building genuine authority in my own areas of expertise became a priority. Instead of borrowing credibility from others, I developed deep knowledge in Pacific Northwest real estate investing. I spent thousands of hours studying market patterns, building relationships with contractors and property managers, learning from my own mistakes rather than relying on guru advice. The strangest discovery was how much mental energy I'd been wasting on unconscious resistance and compliance. Once I started making deliberate choices about when to obey and when to resist, I felt significantly less stressed and more in control of my outcomes. The constant internal struggle between rebellion and submission disappeared when both became strategic tools rather than emotional reactions. My income doubled within 18 months, not because I worked harder, but because I stopped participating in systems designed to extract value from my time and attention. I quit social media entirely and built my business through direct relationships. I avoided companies that required cultural conformity beyond professional competence. I charged premium rates because I only worked with clients who valued strategic thinking over performative busy work. The hardest lesson was accepting that most people prefer unconscious submission to conscious choice. They find strategic decision-making exhausting and would rather follow charismatic leaders, popular trends, or cultural expectations than think through each situation independently. Understanding this helped me stop trying to wake people up who were comfortable sleeping. Today, I evaluate every request, opportunity, and relationship through the lens of strategic consciousness. When my landlord tries to impose unreasonable lease terms, when subscription services use dark patterns to prevent cancellation, when family members attempt emotional manipulation, I respond based on calculated assessment rather than automatic reaction. The ultimate realization was that Machiavelli's principles work both ways. The techniques that powerful people use to control others can be turned inward to control yourself. Self-discipline, strategic thinking, conscious choice. These are the tools that transform you from a pawn in someone else's game into the architect of your own life. Freedom isn't the absence of constraint. It's the conscious choice of which constraints serve your purposes and which ones serve someone else's. Master this distinction, and you'll never be voluntarily imprisoned again.